Welcome to the Terrascope Climate Cafe podcast, featuring conversations from the world of enterprise decarbonization, ESG practices, and the transition to our net zero future. I'm Leah Nicholson, Terrascope's head of sustainability, and today I'm hosting Claire Perry-O'Neill to talk about her career, about crafting policies for net zero, her thoughts on this year's COP28 climate conference, and how she juggles competing stakeholder interests to ultimately deliver collaborative action.
But I am a huge optimist about this, and I think it's an incredible time for problem solvers, for innovators, to just be involved in this. This is amazing. You know, we're talking about something that needs to happen at the scale of the first industrial revolution, at the speed of the digital transformation, with policy aligned, with investment aligned, with CEOs kind of woken up to this. This is amazing. So I am very optimistic about this. I think it will be bumpy. I think we will overshoot targets, near-term targets, but I think we will end up in a net zero place.
Welcome, Claire Perry-O'Neill. We're so thrilled to have you with us today. So Claire has served as UK Minister of State for Energy and Clean Growth and spearheaded the UK's clean growth and green finance strategies. And we're just so thrilled that you're, first of all, serving on our Sustainability Advisory Council as Terrascope, and very glad to welcome you to Singapore in person. So welcome, Claire.
Thank you. It's great. And we've got Ecosperity this week, so there's a lot happening.
Yes, a lot of exciting things happening. Singapore is a hub. So I would love to start by a little bit about your professional career context. Could you tell us a little bit about your work, what motivates you to do it, kind of why you do it, and how did you get into climate change?
Gosh, that could take all afternoon. So very quickly. So I had a business career, business and consulting. I went into politics rather randomly. I ended up in what I thought was the perfect job for me, which was Minister for Energy and Clean Growth in Theresa May's UK cabinet. And it was a wonderful time because we had really strong momentum coming out of the Paris COP, and also very strong cross-party support in the UK for being very ambitious. And we managed to turn the narrative in the UK from fear and worry and cost to hope and opportunity. And I think that's a really important theme. And on the back of that, we were able to, as you say, pass net zero legislation, but also do some really pragmatic things involving the private sector. So the offshore wind sector deal, the Powering Past Coal Alliance that we set up globally, the Green Finance Institute, the Carbon Capture and Storage Task Force. We just did a lot of good stuff and laid very strong foundations. And I think I then left politics in 2019 for various reasons, or 2020, I should say, having brought the COP to the UK. And what I'm able to do now is take that extraordinary luck of being at that interface of policy and private sector work and really focus that on the private sector. So I now have a global portfolio career, as they call it. I serve on some main boards, and I do some advisory work and I do some investment work. But the theme that runs through it is sort of impact and action. And I think you've referred to me as an extreme pragmatist. I just want to know what we need to do tomorrow, because one of the things that frustrates me is if you look at the Keeling curve regularly, as I do, you see CO2 levels at 800,000-year highs. And we've had the biggest demand side shock with with COVID and then the Ukrainian war. And then we've had the biggest supply side shock, with the Ukrainian war. And things haven't really moved. So it's obviously going to take a lot more than demand suppression and supply chain disruption to really move this decarbonisation dial. And I am, in truth, a little frustrated with the theoretical nature that we often bring to this debate. We need to do everything everywhere all at once. And one of the great things about Terrascope, which I know we'll talk about, is in order to do that, you need data, you need trust, you need tools, and then you need an ability to take that data and turn it into action. And that's why I'm so excited to work with you in Terrascope.
Wonderful. And just that everything everywhere all at once. The UN Secretary General, I remember saying that about the IPCC report. And I think people like you, people like the UNSG, who bridge that kind of science into action are so pivotal to see some progress happening. So it sounds like you came and you care about impact, and you come from kind of this somewhat of a climate focus. But what role did climate change or sustainability play in your kind of political
Well, I was a geographer at university, and people always say geography is all about colouring in maps. My husband's very rude about it. It's actually, in my case, it was a lot of focus on atmospheric science, on land changes, and it was a sort of perfect background, really, to understand the science behind this, but also the fact that you're dealing with, multiple places around the world where impacts are happening faster than others. So I think that curiosity and focus on the science and the sort of biospheric interaction has really underpinned a lot of this. But as you say, I also have this business background. So, one of the key questions we never ask ourselves in climate change reaction, whether it's CO2 reduction, removal, adaptation, is who pays? And so you can have all the greatest policies in the world in a government, and policy guardrails are incredibly important. There is no question that governments absolutely led the reaction to the data, the original responses, and that legislative and cooperative framework and COP, which we'll talk about, is so important. But ultimately, in many cases, these are expensive solutions. And the worst thing to do is to burden poor consumers with decisions. And we have a bit of a history of making investments in technology solutions or certain forms of renewable energy. I mean, solar in the UK, not necessarily a great thing to do. We've spent a lot of money putting solar panels on people's roofs, and that's gone on relatively poor people's energy bills. So this pragmatism, who's going to pay for this? And then how do we drop the cost of these responses? How do we make sure that these responses get into the money very quickly is a really important question that we don't ask enough.
And that cost was a key kind of focus of how you were able to bridge the climate action. What's
because of course the flip side of the cost is the opportunity. So it is true that we don't price the external cost also of the impact of climate change. So when we try and do a sort of net present value analysis of this, we don't price things very well at all. But we also neglect to talk about what's the opportunity, where are the growth sectors? And what I find interesting is we treat it as a sort of centrally planned question often. We'll have lots of reports saying there'll be this many green jobs. It's like trying to plan the internet. Nobody ever sat down. Imagine if we'd sat down and planned out the impact of the internet in 1995. We would have been so wrong. So I think it's that sense of, again, of getting into the real world, allowing lots of innovation, lots of investment, lots of rapid failure as well, but not waiting for the perfect solution. We tend to, in the climate space, make perfect the enemy of the good. And so you have pathways. Love a pathway. Say pathways tell us we shouldn't be removing carbon until we've reduced emissions by a certain percent. That's like saying I need to lose 5 kilos, but I'm not allowed to go to the gym until I've lost 4.5. We've got to do everything, everywhere, all at once, as we said. So again, it's that sense of, what's the cost? What are the real costs and benefits? And what are we going to do tomorrow, ultimately?
And that's great because that forward focus is certainly that forward focus analytics is certainly a focus for Terrascope.
Absolutely.
And do you see the internal price on carbon being a useful tool for companies to start making?
Oh, I mean, so it's really interesting. We polled companies at COP and elsewhere through the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, where I co-chair their global board. Most companies start with putting an internal price on carbon because, of course, we have about 25% of global emissions now covered by one form or another of carbon pricing schemes. In Europe, the ETS scheme is delivering price signals of around 80 to 100 euros a tonne. That's actually roughly what the government used to use. But other ETS schemes will be charging $5 a tonne, which is way below what it is. But companies who start by putting a price on internal carbon make, I think, much better investment decisions. And ultimately, carbon pricing will become a hugely important tool. And in a way, what's fascinating about Terrascope is with the data that we can collect and give to our corporate clients, we can help them understand the power of carbon pricing in making those transfer pricing decisions. I think it's very important. I personally, there's another policy thing I'd love to see. I'd love to see the G20 having a minimum carbon price as they did with the minimum tax rate. That would be a really, even if it was $10 a tonne, it would be an incredibly powerful signal and also help a market develop because once something's priced, the cost of it, the downside risk, and you also know the value.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And so if I'm a company in Asia, and especially if I have my eyes on kind of an EU market, so whether that's a retail or manufacturing, would you say one of the first things I'm doing to really understand kind of climate and sustainability would be to put this price on carbon?
And in that particular example, which is a great example, we will, of course, have the carbon border adjustment mechanism coming into play, which, again, I think is actually very powerful because, ultimately, we get accused a lot of offshoring our emissions, and a lot of that is true. And we also know that it's difficult for many developing countries to really, decarbonise their energy systems without massive investment. And having a carbon border tax or, pricing adjustment that enables a little more clarity around that, I think is hugely powerful. And of course, the conversation now is that we'll start with that in the EU, and then that should, I think, roll out to the US quite quickly.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. So looking ahead and kind of taking your lessons learned as a minister in the UK at the time, that you laid the foundation for a successful bid to host COP26 in the UK, ended up being hosted in Glasgow. I'd love to know kind of, and looking at the outcomes that came out of COP26, halving emissions by 2030 was the first time that was documented in text. And looking at phasing out and fossil fuels and subsidies in the same...
Phasing down.
Remember
the row. Yeah.
Phasing out coal.
Yep.
And phasing down fossil fuel subsidies, which were really big pivots and sent like a very strong signal, I think, to get, rather than just abstract pathways, as you're saying, to very specific, these are the actions that we need. So I'd love to know kind of how did you juggle competing interests as energy minister to pave the way for this
Well, you
outcome?
are a COP expert. So, and I think you have a very interesting perspective from the negotiation side. And truthfully, I don't think many people understand what COP is. In fact, at WBCSD, we had a whole 6-month programme of educating our members, some of the world's most sustainable companies. We called it the Green Brick Road because people will say, COP's really important, we must go to COP. And then you say, what's happening? And ultimately, as you know, COP exists to negotiate a text. Everything else is a sideshow. What's happening in the main stage is the text. And some people say, well, that's just nonsense. I mean, why are we spending all this time negotiating a comma or negotiating the colour of the grayscale in the supplementary table? This is mind-blowing. On the other hand, as you say, you can put some very powerful things into the text that give us sort of shared landing zones. And Paris, of course, did that with our temperature. I do want to emphasise we do have 2 degrees as well. The world's not going to end if we hit 1.5, because the scientific evidence into Paris was our safe operating space went up to 2 with significantly greater impact. And that threaded all the way through the negotiations and into the real economy actions. I hate the real economy because the real economy is a blend of public and private. Anyway, let's use that term. In Glasgow, the mission was to get net zero and the concept of shared responsibility, not just between governments, subnational governments and the private sector. And my rallying cry for COP26, and of course I didn't chair it to the final thing, I departed politics before then, as anyone who Googles it can find out. There's a whole story, which we won't go into, was what does it say on the COP T-shirt? And actually the advice I got from the people who led the Paris COP was write the press release now and then tell everyone that's what it's going to be. And my COP26 T-shirt said net zero, everybody's in. And once you had that became our landing zone. And then my view was you take the incredibly powerful assembly of negotiators and this intergovernmental action, some of which can be cynical, as you know. Russia shows up to COP, signs a bunch of stuff whilst the ink is drying on their Ukrainian invasion plan. I mean, this could be a very cynical process. But in general, people are very good-hearted and focused on an outcome. How do you build real-world, real action around that? So COP, we said we need to major on coal because, truthfully, I know this is a little controversial, but I sit on the board of a company that sells oil and gas as well as doing a lot of carbon capture. If you went from coal to gas, you would halve global emissions from that particular source. So coal phase out, and of course the disbenefit of coal in terms of air quality and also production pollution is so huge. We have to get coal out if we're serious. So coal was an important thing. Nature, how do we get natural climate solutions really juiced up and amplified? And that's where we set up the voluntary task force on, getting carbon markets really moving, which you need for compliance markets, but also voluntary markets. Fossil fuel phase out, as you say, that ultimately you need to have a landing zone where you can understand what that looks like. And of course, people who think we can just stop oil from a petrol point of view don't really, in my view, understand the whole petrochemicals industry, but that's another conversation. And then finance, what's one of the things London is good at? London's a financial global hub. How do we really make those financial investments and deals work? And then a few other things came in, like methane, which I think is a very underrated area of focus. So you had a very powerful, clear outcome for your negotiations that you were targeting, and then you had a whole series of sort of, things budding off the amoeba that were very thematically aligned. And we were just really clear about what we were working on. And even though I wasn't there, that was the action plan that was taken forward. And, the advice into COP28 is pick your spots. It's controversial. I think it could be great. I think actually having COP in a very powerful petrostate is really important because the world is still consuming record levels of fossil fuels. But, if we had a massive global commitment on methane and a massive global commitment on carbon removal and a real improvement in the financial transfer mechanism, and that was in the negotiated text as well as the real world outcomes, that would be an amazing package.
Wonderful. And thanks for kind of drawing it full circle towards looking ahead at COP28. I'd love to know, so I also love that T-shirt analogy. What can you fit on a T-shirt?
Yeah. What is it? What's it about?
Absolutely. And so thinking about, the supply side and carbon capture for energy makes sense. From the demand side, kind of downstream, what do you think should be on a T-shirt of a corporate kind of heading into COP28? What would be a win?
Well, I think you're very wise to point out the corporate role, because people always obviously talk about consumer behaviour. And in my view, it's really hard to change consumer behaviour. You can have sudden massive shifts in people choosing, plant-based diets, for example. But it's really hard for consumers, as we're seeing with EVs, to say, I'm going to shift away from a fossil fuel engine. Oh my goodness, there isn't infrastructure to support that. So I think the corporate interface is hugely important. And as you know, there is no statutory role for business at COP. Here's a fun fact. If you read the Glasgow Declaration, all 8 pages, guess how many times it mentions business? 0 times. How can that be? I mean, how can we just ignore the fact that basically the sector that is responsible for most of the world's emissions isn't even mentioned in the text? Indigenous people, 10 times, youth, 12 times. This is important, but this is, for me, a real omission. So what I think is happening is you've had a drumbeat of interest from corporates over the last few years, which really culminated in Glasgow, which was stuffed full of global CEOs saying, I'm here, I get it, this is the new organising principle, what do you want me to do? And I don't think we give enough advice on what we want people to do. And so for me, understanding your emissions has to be the starting point. You can't solve for your own footprint if you don't understand your emissions. And in most industries, those emissions are scope 3. And we know the challenge with scope 3, it's sparse data. There aren't shared data protocols. You can get somebody in to do a report for you, but it's not integrated into your decision making. So it has to start with your emissions. But then there also has to be a realization as to what is it you can actually control. Olam, who span out Terrascope, is a wonderful example of a company that kind of got its house in order very early on this. And if you talk to the CEO, he's very interesting because he says, I look at the SDGs, which is 17 SDGs, times the number of action points. It adds up to 63 things I should be doing. How do I choose what to do when I go to work tomorrow? And my view is you digest that into your kind of Maslow's hierarchy of influence, it's a terrible analogy, and you say, what are the things that really matter? I'm a water-intensive company. So even though I might not, get any points for dealing with water, there's no global compact on water, I'm just going to be really water efficient and organise around that. So for me, it starts with emissions. It has to include nature and biodiversity. It has to include livelihoods. But then really build into your corporate framework things that matter most to you.
Absolutely. And sometimes, especially where we've come from a focus on operations and scope 1 and 2, now shifting into, I think companies are starting to realize as they do supply chain scope 3, just how much exposure they really have looking across that supply chain.
Yes, and also how difficult it is to affect behaviours. So again, cotton production, 25% of emissions come from tilling methods. To change that, you have to do an awful lot of work to empower often subsistence-based farmers who are, so knowledge is the first key. Working out the actions is then so important. But the third thing is integrating it into your management decision-making. In my view, we've won this, or we're winning the war when sustainability data is on a par with financial data. And the CEO and the CFO come to work every day and they look at the share price, they look at the cash flow, they look at the employee satisfaction index, and they look at their emissions data. And the board is the same. And that doesn't happen very often.
More and more, increasingly.
It does. But even so,
yes.
You'll know where, the companies that do that are really globally leading.
Absolutely. And I think we're seeing kind of from an annual emissions inventory down to a quarterly measurement, down to, what would that look like? Kind of monthly, even weekly KPI.
And actually, just to build on that very good point, you're right. And we scrutinise corporate emissions far more than government emissions. Governments show up, they write NDCs. NDCs can be very detailed, or they can literally be like, something your 6-year-old might produce for homework. I mean, I'm joking a bit, but, they're very poor quality. And nobody ever audits them. So there is something about, again, I think the corporate sector can lead by example in this case.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to hear about how you've encouraged collaboration, alignment and synergy on this note, kind of between the regulatory frameworks and the private sector net zero initiatives. You've got that. In some ways, the regulation is driving the private sector. Yes. On others, it's lagging in NDC quality in certain contexts.
And it's a great question. And I think it's almost like a relay that is endless. And sometimes the corporate team's ahead and sometimes the government team's ahead. And the truth is you need both. And so let's take an analogy, which is cash accounting standards. They started voluntarily. A bunch of chaps in I think Edinburgh decided they needed a unified way of reporting the performance of their companies to shareholders. So you started with a voluntary mechanism. 100 years ago, it takes a long time. And then increasingly that was improved. And then you had regulatory involvement. By the way, we still don't have a global shared accounting system. We still have wrinkles in different regions. So, let's be careful to imagine we might have a universal set of emissions accounting standards. But there is this constant interplay, I think, between voluntary action and regulation. And you have to have both. And I think it's a fallacy to suggest that the market can solve this because we don't price the externalities effectively, and corporate value creation does not adequately reflect the costs and the benefits of sustainability action. And that's what true value accounting is, a huge holy grail. But equally, you cannot regulate your way to net zero. And what's been fascinating is the passage of the IRA Act in the US, because that has gone from a very kind of hair-shirty regulatory approach in Europe to saying, have a bunch of money and go forth and innovate. And the impact on green hydrogen solutions, on the cost of carbon sequestration has been absolutely immense. And of course, a place where this comes together, if I'm allowed to do a tiny plug for an NGO, is the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, where Terrascope's parent company, Olam, is a wonderful member, and I co-chair their Global Advisory Board with Sunny Vahesi. That is a place where companies can collaborate in a pre-competitive space, we're always very careful, but can actually work on some of these solutions together. So, what would a good taxonomy look like for carbon capture? How would you define an effective food system? All of these are, what did the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which WBCSD co-wrote with WRI? These are really powerful places which actually front-run regulatory action and then can be used by the regulators effectively.
Yes, World Business Council, not just any NGO. That's an incredible forum. It's an amazing platform. And what's WBCSD gearing up to do at COP28?
So there's a ton of so there are two. Well, the huge question at COP28 is what does the energy transition look like? That has to be the exam question, because you have a chance to work on some of the really awful disbenefits of the current fossil fuel production system, methane being a particular. Methane is just a massive low-hanging fruit, and it's in the money to solve. It's an outrage, actually, that we still have uncontrolled methane emissions. We can also work on carbon removal. I think we can also look through this trajectory of what fossil fuel phase down looks like and how our economy is gearing up. And I think we can model this financial flow mechanism, because people say, well, surely the petrostates who are making a lot of money should be recycling that into lower carbon solutions and also working with other countries on a loss and damage or an adaptation framework. There's a real chance to do that. So energy transition, the other big area of focus, I think, is food and water related to this, because we have a food security crisis as well. And then there are lots of other things that are coming through. There's also a fascinating piece of work that one of the big consulting firms, who I won't name, is looking at, which is a sort of how do you adequately measure transition? We talk a lot about transition. It's one of those buzzwords. What does that really mean? Which countries are transitioning well? Which ones are being left behind? So I think there's a chance to create some really good, useful frameworks around the system as well.
So that sounds like a country question, also a corporate?
Actually, it could be, but I think at the moment targeting countries, but also sub-national levels. So if you're trying to make decisions between particular regions to invest in, who really needs it? And what does good look like? When we say that, what does a good energy transition look like? No one's ever identified that question or answered that question or even put the metrics around that question or tracked it. Right. So there's lots of opportunity.
And like everything, it really starts, what's your baseline? What's your starting position?
Yes, exactly.
And what does progress look like against
But I think the corporate world, again, is saying we want to be there, help us understand. And so again, there's not without criticism. The UAE is making a massive effort to invite and involve corporate leaders. And I've seen some pushback saying, this is a private sector COP. Well, it's both. It's not either or, it's both and. And so I think there is, and again, you're the expert on the COP ecosystem. I sometimes find it a little insular. And I think the COP ecosystem has to evolve. And actually, increasingly, not increasingly, but occasionally you get conversations and people saying, why do we even bother with COP? Why don't we just get rid of it? Because it can be so fractious. It's hugely important, but it has to adapt and evolve.
And how do you use COPs to your advantage? We have them on an annual basis.
We have this global moment which is incredible, where we put this challenge in the spotlight, and you'll know everybody gears up for it, in the corporate level, in the government level. How do we use it and also make promises that we keep? And people say, well, greenwashing, all these companies show up in greenwash. Do you know there's no reporting back mechanism for corporates? At WBCSD, we suggested having a global annual audit of all the net zero promises as a baseline, and then we check the delta every year. We don't have that. That's weird, right? I mean, of course you should be doing that. And it's not encapsulated. People say, well, isn't it in national emissions? NDCs and national emissions are estimates based on local economic activity. They have nothing to do with the corporate footprint in your country.
Yeah, that accountability feedback mechanism, crucial. So I'd love to, kind of the road ahead for COP we've covered, but I'd love to know, what's the road ahead for you? Like, what do you hope to achieve?
I never have to go on political programmes ever again. That's a huge relief. My poor children never have to be told by their friends that their mother's a pain. I think we have an amazing opportunity as we activate. So first of all, I'm a huge optimist about this process. The world's not going to end if we exceed 1.5 degrees. We'd like to stay between 1.5 and 2. I get that. But I also think that we have to be realistic about the trajectory and the momentum that we're on. And that's okay, because we can deal with this stuff. The problem is the people who are least able to deal with it are those who will bear the biggest costs. And that is a question for sort of humanity, if you like. But I am a huge optimist about this, and I think it's an incredible time for problem solvers, for innovators, to just be involved in this. This is amazing. We're talking about something that needs to happen at the scale of the first industrial revolution, at the speed of the digital transformation, with policy aligned, with investment aligned, with CEOs kind of woken up to this. This is amazing. So I am very optimistic about this. I think it will be bumpy. I think we will overshoot targets, near-term targets, but I think we will end up in a net zero place. And the question is really when, and what does that do to temperatures? But for me personally, the opportunity to work in the corporate sector, to work also with some of the regulators and still a little bit in government behind the scenes, but also to work with companies like Terrascope, because I think that there is this amazing space for innovators to really zero in on what's a particular problem. And as we talked about, emissions data, measurement and management and usage is this sort of great unlock, particularly for corporate action. And plus, on a personal level, I find this space is full of really fabulous people who, like yourselves, who are committed, innovative, experienced, passionate, but practical. And that's just a great, that's a great space to be working in. So I imagine my life will be US-based, Singapore-based. I live in the UK, so a bit of international travel, and we still don't have a sustainable aviation solution, so sorry about that. I do try and offset. But I think it's going to be a fascinating few years.
Wonderful. And lastly, what do you hope to achieve on Terrascope's Sustainability Advisory Council?
Well, again, I hope that I can just ultimately be helpful. That's what I'm here to do, to bring the benefit of whatever experiences I've had for the company, and also to be a real advocate for the underlying technology, but also the solution that we're providing. There are some other companies out there doing a similar thing in different regions. I think this is unique. I think the quality of the digital offering, of the actual underlying data offering, the provenance coming out of a food and agricultural sector that is so powerful, with a company that has really led the way, and the quality of the problem solvers that are here really do set us apart.
Wonderful. Well, we hope to be a key part of that industrial scale digital pace transition.
Good. That's our t-shirt.
I love that. There. Yeah, there we go, into COP28. Thank you so much,
Pleasure.
Claire, for joining us. Thank you. As we conclude this episode of the Terrascope Climate Cafe, I hope you've found valuable insights that will inspire you in your own journey towards a sustainable future. Stay tuned for more in-depth conversations with leading experts and changemakers in the upcoming podcasts. Subscribe to our podcast and visit our website at terrascope.com for more resources. Once again, this is the Terrascope Climate Cafe, serving up sustainability one conversation at a time.